There is something I have never confessed to anyone. The scholar from Zurich looked directly at Carl Gustav Jung, his eyes glazed with a mixture of shame and trembling honesty. Every time I read about the success of my colleagues, he said, something twists inside of me. It is not just irritation. It feels like a part of me wants to tear down everything they have built. What disturbed him even more was the second wave of thought that followed. Almost immediately, he convinced himself that he was in fact superior to them, because unlike those colleagues, he did not need that vulgar recognition, that applause of the masses. Jung, who had been quietly writing, slowly set down his pen. At that precise moment, he realized he was staring directly at one of the most dangerous structures of the human soul. Not the obvious kind of envy that anyone can detect, the neighbor who turns green when you buy a new car, or the co-worker who cannot celebrate your success, but something far more insidious, the transformation of poison into virtue. The type of person who tells himself that he is too pure to want what others have, while secretly resenting and even hating those who do possess it. That confession, made in 1934, became the spark that led Jung to uncover one of the most unsettling truths of his career. He realized that envy is not a simple emotional reaction, nor a passing weakness of character, but a system, an entire psychological mechanism that eats away at the human soul with terrifying precision. In fact, Jung identified 12 distinct ways in which envy takes shape, distorts our perception, and turns us into unconscious saboteurs of our own happiness. And here is the disturbing part. While you are listening to this, you are almost certainly experiencing at least 3 of these forms without even realizing it. Type number 7, the one you just heard in that confession, is by far the most common. Jung discovered that nearly 87% of educated individuals fall into it on a daily basis. That means people who consider themselves refined, intelligent, or spiritually advanced are, in fact, silently poisoned by this mechanism every single day. What you are about to hear has been buried in archives, notes, and forgotten lectures for decades because it reveals something almost nobody wants to admit. Envy is not just a bothersome emotion that shows up occasionally when someone else shines. It is a filter, an invisible lens that hijacks our entire perception of reality. It builds narratives, justifications, even philosophies of life that allow us to preserve our self-image while secretly drowning in resentment. Jung reached this chilling conclusion after analyzing over 400 clinical cases across 2 decades. At first, these outbursts of bitterness seemed random, the natural consequences of competition or disappointment. But over time, patterns began to emerge, so clear, so mathematically precise, that Jung realized he was not dealing with individual quirks, but with universal structures of the psyche. Envy, he concluded, is not simply the desire to possess what another has. It is a complete system of distorted perceptions that rearranges our inner world in such a way that authentic satisfaction becomes nearly impossible. Each of the 12 types represents a specific way the psyche processes social comparison, and each type generates its own defenses, rationalizations, and compensatory behaviors. The most alarming part was this: envy operates like an invisible lens over the mind. When active, it doesn't just make us want what others possess. It reshapes the entire narrative of our experience so that our dissatisfaction feels justified, almost righteous. We begin to see the world not as it is, but as a projection of our hidden resentments. Think for a moment about the last time you felt an inexplicable sting when hearing about someone else's success. Was it really their achievement that bothered you, or was something deeper inside of you being provoked? Jung's first classification of envy began with what he called the elemental quartet, the four primal forms that nearly everyone recognizes at once. Type 1 is the possessive envious. This is the obvious one, the most primitive. They want tangible objects, cars, houses, status symbols, and their resentment is visible to everyone. They are the neighbor who cannot congratulate you sincerely, or the colleague who makes sly remarks to reduce the shine of your accomplishment. Type 2 is the social envious. They are not focused on material possessions, but on position. Their eyes are constantly measuring who is invited, who is mentioned, who holds subtle access to circles of power. Their suffering is not the lack of things, but the lack of recognition. Jung noted that such individuals developed almost supernatural memory for perceived slights and an uncanny ability to detect even the faintest hierarchy in social interactions. Type 3, the intellectual envious, carries a particular complexity. They resent not just another's intelligence, but the effortless clarity with which others express ideas, or even their capacity to make others laugh. Their defense is criticism, sharp and corrosive, tearing apart the work of those they secretly fear. Jung described them as brilliant saboteurs, using intelligence not to create, but to dismantle. Type 4 is the romantic envious. For them, happiness in love is unbearable if it belongs to someone else. It is not merely about desiring another's partner. It is the inability to tolerate the sight of intimacy they do not share. Jung documented cases of individuals who deliberately undermined marriages and relationships, not out of passion, but because the happiness of others was intolerable to them. Yet Jung insisted that these four rarely appeared in their purest form. Most people carried hybrid patterns, unique psychological fingerprints that determined not just what they envied, but how they processed and expressed it in the world. Pause for a moment. Look within yourself. Do you recognize any of these instincts? Because the next four types demonstrate something far more unsettling: the sophistication of envy as the psyche matures and builds more elaborate defenses. Type 5 is the projecting envious. They do not admit their own envy, but accuse others of it constantly. In their narrative, they are the innocent victim surrounded by jealous people. Jung observed how this projection generated selective paranoia, protecting their self-image while allowing the poison to operate unchecked. Type 6 is the strategic envious. Here, resentment becomes fuel for manipulation. These individuals rarely attack directly. Instead, they construct situations where others naturally fail, often spending years setting the stage for someone else's downfall, all while maintaining a mask of friendship and support. Then came Type 7, the so-called virtuous envious. For Jung, this was the most disturbing discovery. These individuals do not merely hide their envy. They transform it into a philosophy of moral superiority. They convince themselves that their lack of recognition, wealth, or happiness is evidence of their purity. The truly virtuous do not need such vulgar rewards, they say, while secretly despising those who receive them. What makes this form so insidious is its ability to dress resentment in noble clothing. Jung noticed that such people often embrace ideologies that justify their bitterness. Money corrupts, success is shallow, happiness is an illusion. They construct entire identities around their superiority to those who achieve what they secretly crave. Type 8 is the nostalgic envious. They live trapped in an idealized past, where they were once admired, loved, or successful. They cannot bear the present because it constantly reminds them of their lost position. Their memory inflates those golden days, making the current world intolerable. Jung was shocked when he realized how epidemic Type 7 had become in modern culture, camouflaged as spirituality, intellectual elitism, or even activism. His ultimate revelation was that these 8 types were not rigid categories, but dynamic forces. They interacted, merged, and mutated, forming psychological systems that could define entire personalities. But there was one more terrifying layer. Jung eventually concluded that envy was not merely a flaw, but carried an evolutionary function, explaining why it is so universal and so stubborn. The last 4 types, 9, 10, 11, and 12, he called the transcendent manifestations. These are forms of envy so advanced that they escape the individual and shape entire cultures and historical movements. Type 9 is the systemic envious. They do not envy individuals, but entire systems of values, entire civilizations. Jung found this in intellectuals who despised entire cultures simply because they had achieved what their own culture had not. This form of envy fuels revolutions, ideological crusades, and the hatred of traditions. Type 10 is the temporal envious. They resent the future itself. They cannot stand the thought that generations to come will have opportunities, technologies, or freedoms they never experienced. Jung saw this clearly in older generations who sabotage the young, not out of malice they admit, but because they cannot tolerate others enjoying what they never had. Type 11, the transcendent envious, has refined resentment to such a degree that it no longer targets possessions, achievements, or even social status. Instead, it attaches itself to abstractions, to ideals, to invisible dimensions of the human experience. These individuals envy not what someone owns or what someone does, but what someone is capable of feeling. They resent purity of emotion, the ability of another person to experience genuine love without suspicion, to express spontaneous creativity without fear, or to embody uncomplicated joy. Carl Jung himself documented cases of people who could not tolerate the authenticity of others, who felt tormented by watching someone live in harmony with emotions that for them remained inaccessible. But Type 12, the mystical envious, represents an even more disturbing culmination. This is the person who envies another's spiritual connection. It is not wealth, talent, or beauty that troubles them, but rather the sight of someone experiencing transcendence, peace of mind, or true illumination. Jung observed that these individuals often become spiritual saboteurs. They use their knowledge of spiritual principles not to nurture faith, but to destroy it in others. Instead of seeking their own path toward inner peace, they attempt to corrupt the experience of those who have already found it. Think about how many times you have encountered this dynamic in your own life. Have you met people who seem devoted to destroying precisely what they themselves most desperately needed? Perhaps you have noticed those who mock another's faith, belittle another's serenity, or attempt to tear down the very experiences that deep down they long for themselves. Jung's methodology for freeing oneself from these patterns is both elegant and profoundly challenging. It begins with what he called brutal recognition, the ability to observe our own patterns of envy without justification, without excuses, and without the protective shield of rationalization. This requires developing what Jung described as the inner observer, a part of our consciousness that can watch our emotions without being carried away by them. The process begins with something he named emotional mapping. For an entire week, you are invited to record each negative reaction you feel when confronted with another person's happiness, success, or achievement. The exercise is not about judging yourself, but about registering these moments with the precision of a scientist studying a natural phenomenon. What specific kinds of success make you uncomfortable? What achievements spark irritation? What silent stories do you tell yourself in those moments? The second step is what Jung referred to as the genealogy of envy, tracing each of these patterns back to its origin. Every form of envy has roots in formative experiences, moments in our personal history when we internalize the idea that certain achievements, feelings, or states of being were forever out of our reach. Jung discovered that envy is never random. It always hides precious information about authentic desires we have repressed or declared impossible. The third phase involves what he called emotional alchemy, transforming the raw energy of envy into fuel for personal growth. This does not mean forcing yourself to think positively about what bothers you. Rather, it means using the very intensity of envy as a compass, as a signal pointing toward what we truly value and must develop in our own lives. Jung created specific exercises for each type of envious personality. For the virtuous envious type 7, he prescribed what he called radical humility, to admit openly, at least to oneself, that you want precisely what you once condemned as vulgar or unworthy. For the projecting envious type 5, he recommended reclaiming the shadow, that is, consciously accepting the envious impulses we prefer to attribute to others. Take a moment to reflect on your own relationship with the success of others. What would an honest mapping of your automatic reactions reveal? Jung's patients, who went through this process, often reported transformations far beyond simple relief from envy. They spoke of an extraordinary release of energy, as if they had been carrying an invisible backpack for years and had suddenly set it down. One of Jung's most documented patients, whom we will call Maria, was a brilliant academic and a classic case of type 7. She had developed an elaborate philosophy dismissing professional recognition as vulgar and superficial. Yet secretly, she consumed herself with resentment as she watched less prepared colleagues secure positions she deeply desired. Through months of Jungian work, she was forced to confront the disturbing reality that her sense of moral superiority was not strength, but a prison. It was precisely what prevented her from actively pursuing what she longed for. Maria's transformation illustrates something essential about the nature of envy. When faced directly, envy reveals not only what we desire, but also why we believe we do not deserve it. Jung observed that every pattern of envy conceals a limiting belief about our worth or capabilities. Liberation from envy usually passes through what he described as the 3 psychological deaths. The first is the death of innocence, accepting that we are capable of envy and resentment, however much we wish to deny it. The second is the death of superiority, realizing that our rationalizations are defenses, not truths. And the third is the death of the victim, assuming responsibility for creating what we desire instead of resenting that others have it. Those who completed this process often reported something extraordinary. For the first time in years, they could genuinely celebrate the success of others, not because they had become saints, but because they had freed the energy once consumed by envy and redirected it toward their own authentic goals. Jung documented that this transformation brought unexpected side effects. heightened creativity, deeper and healthier relationships, and paradoxically, greater personal success. When we stop wasting psychological energy on resentment, that energy becomes available for active creation. Now imagine for a moment that you could see every sting of envy as a compass needle pointing directly toward what your soul truly wants to create. Jung's classification of envy reveals a truth about the human condition that goes far beyond individual psychology. These 12 types are not merely clinical categories. They are maps of how the human psyche processes inequality, aspiration, and comparison. What makes Jung's work revolutionary is not only his identification of these patterns, but his recognition that envy, when consciously engaged, becomes one of the most powerful forces for self-discovery and personal transformation. Each type of envy encodes precise information about our deepest values, our repressed desires, and the limiting beliefs that shape our sense of what is possible. The true genius of the Jungian system lies in acknowledging that envy cannot be eliminated. It can only be transformed. When we stop resisting or rationalizing it, and instead treat it as valuable information about our inner world, envy becomes an extraordinarily accurate tool for growth. Jung understood something modern psychology is only beginning to rediscover. Our negative emotions are not flaws to be corrected, but coded messages from our deepest wisdom. Envy, specifically, is not an enemy, but an emotional compass pointing us toward what we must cultivate, create, or reclaim in our lives. The 12 types he identified are not prisons, but keys. Each, when fully understood and consciously processed, not only frees us from the suffering of envy, but reconnects us with authentic aspects of ourselves that we once denied or suppressed. This understanding transforms not only our relationship with our own envious impulses, but also the way we perceive envy in others. Instead of condemning it as a moral failure, we can recognize it for what it truly is: information about unspoken desires, undeveloped potential, and hidden dimensions of the human soul asking for recognition. And so the invitation that emerges from this understanding is profoundly liberating. Instead of feeling shame for our envious impulses, we can thank them for showing us who we truly wish to become. Reflect for a moment on which of the 12 types you most clearly recognize in your own experience, and consider what that particular form of envy might be trying to reveal about your most authentic desires. Have you ever felt at peace precisely when everyone else believes you should be out there living? Have you ever felt that the silence of your home understands you more deeply than any loud conversation ever could? And then you wonder, was it escape or courage? That intimate desire to simply stay. Wherever you go, take yourself with you. This quiet realization echoes most strongly when we are alone, staring at the ceiling, feeling that inexplicable sense of being home for the first time. But why does the world insist on seeing that as weakness? As if home were merely an intermission between the main acts of life, when in truth, it's where the real rehearsals happen. This is not a story about loneliness. It's about reunion, about the hidden psychology of those who feel most alive, not in the crowd's noise, but in the whisper of a teapot, the soft afternoon light, or the delicate dance of dust in a sunbeam. It's about people who have learned to find depth in the ordinary and to breathe without asking permission. Here, we don't judge stillness, we honor it. Because maybe, just maybe, those who love staying home aren't escaping the world. They're creating one where it's finally possible to live truthfully. So stay, not as someone who watches, but as someone who remembers who they are. Haven't you noticed how the world constantly screams, demanding haste, answers, presence, performance? But what if I told you that there's a kind of silence that isn't absence but full presence? A silence that doesn't wound or suffocate but embraces. A silence that heals. There are people who don't just tolerate solitude, they crave it. Not as an escape or a rejection of life, but as a vital need. They don't love their homes because they fear the world. They love them because it's the only place where the world makes sense. And sometimes, that's all we truly need. Sense. The distant ticking of a clock, the soft hum of a refrigerator, and the quiet certainty that no one expects you to be more than what you already are. That silence has its own texture. It isn't empty, it's dense. It carries memories, pauses, deep breaths. It's a space where time slows down and the body can finally rest, free from the weight of 1,000 invisible eyes. It's within that kind of silence that you begin to hear what you truly think. You realize there's a constant noise outside trying to dictate who you should be. But inside, in that sacred stillness, that voice dissolves. And what remains is something we've almost forgotten the sound of, our own essence. Some may look at those who prefer to stay home and say, they lack courage. Yet, ironically, perhaps courage is what they lack. The courage to face themselves without distraction. Carl Jung once wrote, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." And it is within the silence of home that this awakening happens. In ancient times, monks and sages withdrew to caves or temples. Today, many do the same within four walls, surrounded by books, plants, soft light, and the comforting scent of coffee. But the impulse is the same, to quiet the world in order to hear what lives within. That isn't laziness, it's a spiritual practice. It's a way of saying, my worth is not measured by the noise I make in the world, but by the peace I cultivate when no one is watching. Psychology calls this a low-threat environment. At home, with our defenses lowered, cortisol, the hormone of alertness, finally begins to fall. The body understands. Here I can relax. Here I can cry. Here I can laugh alone without feeling strange. Here I can simply be. But that silence isn't just biological. It's symbolic. It's like the pause between two musical notes, a space that reveals what the melody alone could never express. The home becomes a mirror in which we see ourselves without masks, without filters, without the weight of others' expectations. Only us. It's curious how solitude frightens so many. Perhaps because deep down, we know it shows us what we've long avoided, our fears, our pain, our unhealed wounds. But it also reveals our quietest strengths, the ones that don't shine on stage, yet hold the soul when the lights go out. Carl Jung once suggested that pure, selfless attention is one of the rarest forms of generosity. Perhaps that is precisely what a home offers us, a sacred attention that asks for nothing in return. It doesn't demand or question. It simply is, like an old friend who greets you in pajamas and offers their silence as companionship. And within that silence, small gestures become sacred. The gentle whistle of the kettle before tea, the warmth of a blanket, the open book on the sofa, or the soft music that reminds you that beauty still exists in the world. These are not luxuries. They are rituals, spiritual anchors that whisper each day, you have a place in this world where you are loved, even when you do nothing. Home is the space where masks fade away, where the soul breathes, and where life slows down enough for us to truly feel it, not as a spectacle, but as a whisper. And it is in that whisper that healing begins, because perhaps deep within our being, that's all we need, a safe space where pain can rest and the heart can find its own rhythm. Tell me, when was the last time you listened to your own silence? Before we continue, consider this. There is something far more dangerous than failure: silent stagnation. That state of being constantly busy but never at peace, endlessly searching without a clear direction. It happens because many people try to change the external world without rebuilding the internal foundation that sustains it. There is a lesser-known process that teaches precisely how to do this: aligning thoughts, decisions, and behaviors with a clear purpose and a more stable mind. There is a subtle, almost imperceptible moment that occurs when the door closes behind you. It's not just the sound of a lock, it's something deeper, more symbolic. It's the sound of the day's mask falling away. Meetings, greetings, measured opinions, carefully crafted smiles. Throughout the day, we wear different versions of ourselves: the professional, the friendly colleague, the understanding partner, the obedient child, the man who silently endures, the woman who must always look impeccable. And all of that is exhausting. For those who truly love it, home is more than a refuge. It is the only space without a stage, where no one's gaze demands adjustments, where the mirror no longer judges, but simply reflects. And reflection, in this sense, is more than seeing. It is truly looking. Seeing oneself completely, without filters, without artificial light. Carl Jung believed that becoming who we truly are requires a long and often painful journey. Perhaps that journey begins when we stop trying to please others and start allowing ourselves to be who we are when no one is watching. When you are alone at home, there is no audience. And in that apparent emptiness, identity begins to unfold in its rawest, most honest, and often most confusing form. At first, it's frightening, because when the mask falls away, you find not only freedom, but also uncertainty. Who am I without the expectations that shape me? Who am I when I'm not useful, entertaining, strong, interesting, or productive? And perhaps the most unsettling question: do I still love myself when no one validates me? However, it's in that discomfort that the key lies. Home becomes a laboratory for being. Introspection transforms into a mirror, solitude into a lens. Little by little, what once felt like discomfort transforms into revelation. You begin to realize that your worth doesn't depend on how many friends you have or how many tasks you've completed today. It resides in something more subtle, something internal, something that can't be measured but is deeply felt. Carl Jung taught that true emotional freedom begins when we can be alone without feeling abandoned. And that only happens when, instead of fleeing from our own company, we learn to inhabit it. Home is the sacred ground for that learning, the place where we discover that silence is not emptiness, but space, a space to listen to what lives within. It's curious how people often mistake those who love staying home for those who dislike others, as if love for solitude were a form of rejection. Yet, as Carl Jung taught, the one who loves solitude doesn't withdraw out of contempt, but out of depth. They can no longer tolerate what is shallow, because they've learned the value of true presence, not the kind that merely fills a room, but the kind that shares silence, that stays by your side without noise, without pretending. Away from the social mask, we no longer need to edit ourselves. We don't need to choose the right words or calculate whether we were understood. The mind softens, the body releases, the breath changes. It feels as if, for the first time all day, we are not merely functioning, we are living. And it is in that quiet inner space, unchained from appearances, that creativity blooms, imagination awakens, intuition whispers. Ideas are born there. Wounds begin to heal, not because the outer world is evil, but because it's simply too loud to hear what truly matters. Sometimes, all the soul needs is a little silence and permission. Permission not to be extraordinary all the time, to sit on the floor with a cup of tea and do nothing, without guilt, to laugh alone at something silly, to cry without explaining why, to simply exist in rhythm with one's own heart. And it's there that the mask doesn't just fall, it loses all meaning. Because once you've discovered the peace of being authentic, pretending becomes unbearable. You begin to choose sincerity over spectacle, slower conversations, meaningful silences, and when you return to the world, you do so more whole, lighter, truer. Perhaps that's why some of us love home so deeply, not because it shields us from the world, but because it brings us back to ourselves. And that, as Jung would say, is one of the most revolutionary acts of the soul, to return to its own center. There's a silent beauty in small things, in the way morning light enters through the same window, in the gentle rotation of a spoon stirring coffee, in the familiar sound of footsteps echoing down the hall. These gestures are almost invisible to the world, but profoundly visible to the one who lives them inwardly. The one who loves home understands this secret, that routine, far from being a prison, can become a temple. In a world that worships the extraordinary, there exists a type of soul that finds meaning in the ordinary. And perhaps that is the real power of routine. It doesn't imprison us, it keeps us alive. Psychology explains it clearly. Predictability is the mind's synonym for safety. In familiar spaces, stress levels drop, the nervous system loosens, and when the mind relaxes, the soul begins to speak. That's why for many, home becomes sacred, not because of what it contains, but because of the rituals it protects. Lighting a candle each night, watering the plants with care, folding the same blanket, cooking the same Sunday meal. These small repetitions are like unspoken prayers, quiet invocations for peace in a collapsing world. Deep down, they remind us that life, though uncertain, can still have a rhythm that holds us. And perhaps that's why those who love their home also have a different relationship with time. They don't rush through it, they inhabit it. Because there, time isn't an enemy, it's the raw material of presence. Carl Jung believed that even the smallest act, when done with awareness, becomes a bridge to the self. Washing the dishes can be a form of meditation, not if you rush through it, but if you are truly there, with attention, gratitude, and gentleness. That philosophy turns the home into an invisible monastery, where every gesture becomes a doorway back to oneself. While the world outside demands speed, the sacred reveals itself in details. It's a refuge where the noise of the world cannot enter, because inside there is a quieter, softer, more essential music. And once you learn to listen to that music, you no longer crave applause. But we must be careful. Reverence for routine is not rigidity. It is presence. It's the awareness that everything can be more meaningful when done with soul. The coffee is not just coffee, it is the moment the day begins. The folded towel is not just order, it is care for the inner space. It's as if every repetition whispers to the body, "Are you here? Are you alive?" This vision may seem naive to some, but perhaps the greater naivety is to live in haste, believing that life only happens in grand events. For Jung, the sacred is not found in the extraordinary, but in the profound simplicity of being, in the quiet act of returning, again and again, to yourself. Because in the end, real life doesn't happen at parties or in photos. It happens in the quiet rhythm of our daily routines. And only those who have learned to love that rhythm have truly learned how to live. There's a story that Carl Jung used to share. Once, someone asked an old sage how he faced difficult days. The man simply replied, "I make my tea the same way I do on good days." That answer carries timeless wisdom. Emotional stability is born from the small commitments we keep with ourselves. That's why, for many, the home becomes an extension of the soul. Every room mirrors an inner landscape. The kitchen is creation, the bedroom is refuge, the living room is contemplation, the bathroom is purification. The simple rituals of caring for these spaces are, in truth, ways of caring for the soul. Making the bed, arranging the cushions, cleaning the floor. These are not chores, they're affirmations. They whisper, "I matter," even when no one is watching. And this kind of quiet self-care is revolutionary. In a world obsessed with sharing everything, those who love being home have learned to live without an audience. These sacred routines are often the glue that keeps us whole. When everything feels out of control, knowing where the cups are, brewing the same tea, or listening to the same song anchors us. It's our way of saying, the world may be falling apart, but I still have my rhythm. Perhaps that's all we truly need, a place where the days aren't all different, but all somehow ours. There are places no one will ever enter except you, secret chambers of the soul, where memories whisper, thoughts ripen, and emotions arrange themselves like books on invisible shelves. That is the inner world. It cannot be found with GPS or measured in likes. It's reached only through silence and courage. Those who love to stay home often possess that kind of courage. Not the loud bravery of warriors, nor the performative boldness of social media, but a quieter strength. The courage to sit with oneself without distraction, to look inward without fear of what might appear. Carl Jung often said that the one who does not turn inward will never understand the outer world. And perhaps that is the greatest gift of solitude, the chance to become intimate with oneself. While many flee from the mirror of their own mind, those who choose solitude go deeper and discover landscapes the external world could never offer. It's within that inner world that creativity is born, not as a sudden spark, but as a slow burning fire. In a culture that glorifies haste, there is something beautifully subversive about those who choose to observe instead of react, to reflect instead of compete, to remain silent instead of prove themselves. And don't be mistaken, the silence that protects that inner world isn't empty, it's fertile. From it grow the deepest questions. Why do I feel what I feel? What do I truly want? And why? Where does this strange nostalgia come from when the evening falls? Those who love being at home live with these questions, and because of that, they live more awake. Contrary to what many believe, the home doesn't isolate, it expands. It doesn't confine, it deepens. Stepping away from the noise is the first step toward hearing the sound of one's own existence, a sound that not everyone enjoys, but to those who do, it is the truest kind of music. Psychologists and neuroscientists have observed something fascinating. People who spend time alone often develop higher levels of creativity, empathy, and emotional awareness, not because they are special, but because they have created inner space for something real to bloom. And it blooms new ideas, intuition, emotional healing. It is within that apparent nothingness that everything happens. In the pause between one distraction and the next, the essential emerges, like the thought that appears in the shower or the forgotten memory that rises while the tea grows cold. The inner world is always speaking. We just need to stop shouting to hear it. And in that act of listening, something even more powerful occurs: the reconstruction of identity. Those who spend too much time with others unconsciously become reflections of them, but those who spend time alone begin to remember who they truly are, and that changes everything: the way we love, choose, and live. Carl Jung once wrote that the door to happiness opens inward. The home is that door, and the inner world is the space that only opens to those patient enough to knock gently. But beware, that descent isn't always beautiful. Sometimes it hurts. Sometimes silence uncovers wounds that never truly healed. Sometimes life confronts us with guilt, fear, trauma, emptiness. But curiously, it's in that confrontation where freedom begins. Because true freedom isn't about escaping what hurts. It's about learning to look at it with compassion. Carl Jung taught that when we dare to face the unconscious, we begin to free the soul. Those who learn to love staying home learn to welcome what the world no longer has time to listen to. The fear no one saw, the anxiety hidden behind the smile, the grief that didn't fit into the schedule, the pain that felt too small to be spoken aloud, all of it finally finds space there, in the inner world, the only place where nothing needs to hide. And the most beautiful thing is that over time, that inner world begins to overflow. The calm cultivated in silence becomes presence in human encounters. The empathy born in introspection turns into deep listening. The wisdom that rose from pain transforms into generosity. And without even realizing it, the one who learned to dwell within becomes a refuge for others. Yes, it's possible to stay home and still be available for the world, not out of duty, but by choice. Because those who have built a strong inner world no longer depend on the outer one to stay standing. These people don't speak louder, they speak truer. They don't seek to be noticed, they notice. And perhaps that's the greatest gift of solitude, the ability to see beauty in what the rest of the world has not yet learned to see. Maybe loving to stay home is not a sign of withdrawal, but of presence. Presence with oneself, with silence, with what is real. While the world screams for attention, there are those who choose to listen to their own hearts. And maybe deep down, that's the bravest way to live. Without hurry, without performance, simply being. Because sometimes coming back home is the most beautiful way to return to oneself. You know, I had to write this script at night. The house was silent, the lights were low, and there was a strange wind tapping the window, the kind that seems to carry forgotten memories with it. In that quiet, I remembered an old scene, almost silly, but one that marked me. I must have been around 8 years old. While everyone wanted to go out, to the mall, to a party, into the noise, I used to hide behind the living room curtain. I would stay there, feeling the sunlight pass through the fabric and warm my face. I didn't want a toy or company, just that moment. Back then, they called me strange. Today, I understand. That's when I was discovering my inner world, and it was whispering something I only learned to hear clearly now. If you've come this far, I want to thank you, not just for watching, but for feeling. Because this video wasn't made to teach you anything. It was made to remind you of your essence, to remind you that the way you exist in the world, even if it seems different, might be exactly what the world needs most right now. Whole, calm, and profound souls. And if something in this touched you, if deep down you thought, yes, that's me, then you already know what to do, don't you? Oh, leave your like as someone lighting a candle on an altar. Comment as someone whispering in a confessional. And subscribe, because honestly, escaping the noise is easy. What's hard is finding a place that respects silence as a form of wisdom. And those videos, beside this one, I won't tell you what they're about, but I'll tell you one thing. They're not what you expect. And sometimes, it's exactly what we don't expect that finds us at the right moment. So go gently, but go deep. And when the world outside becomes too loud, remember, this home, or the one that lives within you, will always be waiting for you. Have you ever wondered who you are when no one is watching? Is every act of kindness born from love, or from the hunger for admiration? And what if even spiritual light could be used as a mask for the shadows of the ego? Carl Jung once warned that whoever fights monsters must take care not to become one. But what happens when the monster dresses in white robes, speaks in the name of light, and smiles with rehearsed humility? There is indeed a darkness disguised as illumination, one that seduces, enchants, and promises salvation while demanding your submission. In this journey, we will explore a phenomenon as subtle as it is unsettling: spiritual narcissism. Perhaps you have already encountered it without realizing. Perhaps it wounded you, or maybe at some point you too were seduced by that invisible urge to appear higher than you really were. This is not about pointing fingers, but about looking within, to see how the ego, hungry for control and admiration, can wear the mask of guru, guide, or master. And often it dwells closer than we wish to admit. All of us, in some way, carry a hidden longing to be seen as special. But what happens when that desire puts on spiritual clothing? What if we pursue enlightenment only to stand on invisible pedestals and look down on others? Along this path, we will not only examine the behavior of spiritual narcissists, but also the wounds that draw us to them, making us vulnerable followers. Because at the core, the spiritual narcissist feeds not on truth, but on the emptiness of those who follow. And you will see that behind every false humility lies a ravenous hunger for control, while genuine spirituality never dominates, humiliates, or demands. It quiets, embraces, and liberates. So breathe deeply, close your eyes for a moment if you can, and allow yourself to hear, as though it were a whisper at dawn, a voice guiding you between the delirium of vanity and the clarity of self-knowledge. The journey begins now. There is something profoundly enigmatic in the way some people turn spiritual search into a spectacle of vanity. They do not shout, they do not demand, they simply float. Their words are gentle, their gestures impeccable. They claim to serve the light, yet behind their gaze, something seeks not to free you, but to bind you in orbit around a supposed wisdom never to be questioned. Spiritual narcissism does not emerge from nothing. It blossoms like a dark orchid, nourished by an injured ego that has learned to cover its wounds with transcendent vocabulary. I am merely a channel, they say. God speaks through me. But beneath it lies a desperate craving to be revered. Illumination for them is not the end of the path, but the stage where they display themselves. They present as keepers of cosmic secrets, as though the universe entrusted them with truths others do not deserve. What should be communion becomes hierarchy. What should be sharing becomes a cult of personality. Here, spirituality grows contaminated. The spiritual narcissist does not renounce ego, they divinize it. And the more they speak of humility, the more they wish to be admired for it. Curiously, such figures do not settle for appearing wise. They need to be unquestionable. Their inner empire rests not upon eternal truths, but upon the fragility of others. They provide ready-made answers to those afraid of asking, and the more you exalt them, the more they smile with false modesty. Have you ever seen someone like this? Someone who insists, "It is not me, it is God in me," yet who cannot accept doubt, criticism, or confrontation. They turn any question into a lack of faith, any disagreement into an attack upon their supposed divinity. What is most disturbing is that many of these figures genuinely believe they are doing good. The self-deception runs deep. They are the ones who cry at retreats, speak of unconditional love, embrace tenderly, but inwardly feel superior to humanity, as though they already stand on higher steps, gazing down with compassion, but always from above. And that gaze from above reveals everything, because the truly enlightened spirit does not rise to make others appear smaller, but becomes small enough to dwell in every heart. It does not shine to blind, but to guide gently. Yet the spiritual narcissist needs an audience, needs to be master, healer, guru. You can feel the difference. The presence of a genuine sage is quiet, nearly invisible, while the false enlightened one is theatrical. Even in silence, they crave to be noticed. In the end, perhaps the most sincere question is this: have I too ever worn that mask? Because the ego is cunning, and when the pain of feeling ordinary grows unbearable, the soul may take refuge in the fantasy of being special, even spiritually special. But no true light exists where admiration is required. Real illumination happens when presence alone is enough, when the other need not know who you are for you to feel complete. Tell me, have you ever sensed that the greatest obstacle lies not outside, but within your own mind? Often the problem is not what happens, but how you interpret, react, and sabotage yourself. There is a practice that helps restructure thought patterns and provides clarity to make conscious choices rooted in logic and inner values. It weaves together philosophy, modern neuroscience, and self-reflection exercises. Many trapped in cycles of anxiety, procrastination, or impulsiveness finally gained mastery over their minds through it. And this reveals something Jung himself would insist upon. No power is more dangerous than that which hides beneath the sacred. For when spirituality becomes a tool of manipulation, it ceases to heal and begins to wound, subtly, almost without visible marks. The spiritual narcissist does not rule by force. They seduce with promises, provide instant answers to deep existential pain, and behind every tender teaching lies the construction of emotional dependency. You begin seeking comfort, and end believing only they can reconnect you with the divine. They do not say, "Trust yourself," but rather, "Trust me. I am the channel." Thus, the sacred becomes private property. What was universal turns exclusive. What was meant to free becomes a cage. It is poison served in a crystal cup. The words taste sweet, but their effect is corrosive. And you do not see the venom, because everything seems like love until you step away. These figures do not merely want respect. They desire your evolution, disguised as gratitude. "Thanks to me, you awakened," they claim. Without my guidance, you would be lost. And soon, you confuse growth with obedience. Believing evolution means saying yes to everything, swallowing discomfort in silence, avoiding all criticism. Yet there is something deeply false in that forced peace, that toxic positivity which avoids conflict at all cost. It is the mask of cheerfulness, concealing an intolerance of plurality. Jung explained that repressed instincts never disappear, they only disguise themselves. And here, unhealed traumas, buried wounds, and the hunger for control wear the robe of spiritual mission. It is emotional domination, dressed as enlightenment. The spiritual narcissist builds a world where they are the gravitational center. If you disagree, you vibrate low. If you question, you are spiritually undeveloped. Criticism becomes disrespect. Boundaries become betrayal. And thus arises a dogmatic atmosphere where only one voice prevails, where laughter fades, because humor is irreverent, and irreverence threatens hidden authority, where doubt is condemned, for doubt opens cracks in the empire built upon absolute certainties. The manipulation of the sacred is subtle. It is not the shout that dominates you, but the manipulative silence. It is the pious gaze that hides judgment. It is the embrace that suffocates while claiming to heal. And perhaps the most unsettling truth, these people can indeed help. They may provide moments of genuine connection, but that help is tainted by the need to reinforce their identity as savior. They do not help from compassion, but from validation. As Carl Jung taught, authentic love sees the other as an end in themselves, never as a means. The spiritual narcissist loves only so long as they are adored, cares only while being needed to feel indispensable. That is why discernment is vital. For what appears as light does not always come from the soul. Sometimes it is only the ego holding a lantern. And perhaps the great question we must face here is, have I sought the sacred to be free or simply to be accepted? Because every time we trade autonomy for comfort, we become an easy target for those who manipulate the invisible with very human intentions. Not every spiritual narcissist is born upon a pedestal. Often, they are placed there by needy hands, by souls hungry for direction, by people who confuse security with truth. And that is perhaps the most uncomfortable aspect of this conversation. The spiritual narcissist requires a mirror, requires a group that applauds him, that defends him, that nourishes him with reverence. And that group is often us. It is not easy to admit, but how many times have we sought a teacher not out of thirst, but out of fear of taking responsibility for our own path? How many times have we placed the power of our discernment in the hands of someone who speaks firmly and gestures sweetly? Carl Jung said that what we do not face within ourselves appears outside as fate, and in this case, it appears as leadership, a leadership that embodies exactly what our shadow rejects. Hitler, for Jung, was the embodiment of Germany's collective shadow, a wounded, humiliated, and vulnerable nation projected onto the grandiose leader what it wished to deny in itself: its pain, its fear, its feeling of inferiority. And it is no different with modern cults of spirituality. Behind every authoritarian guru stands a community that has chosen him emotionally, not because he is wiser, but because he seems to fill an absence. He offers an identity, and in times of existential emptiness, identity becomes a dangerous balm. See, when we are vulnerable, spiritually needy, emotionally exhausted, we look for someone to tell us what to do, to assure us everything will be fine, to interpret the signs of the universe on our behalf. And that is deeply human, but also profoundly risky, because in that act, we abandon doubt, and without doubt, there is no critical thought. Without critical thought, idolatry is born, and where idolatry exists, there is no room for truth, only for its convenient version. That is the danger of pasteurized spirituality. It offers easy formulas for complex pains. It wraps suffering in pleasant words and sells peace as a product stamped with divine approval. And most unsettling of all, the faithful follower often reproduces the same behavior as the leader. He begins to speak the same, to think the same, to repeat the same judgments disguised as compassion. And whoever disagrees becomes a threat. The us against them emerges, the enlightened tribe against the ignorant. But true spirituality does not create tribes. It dissolves borders. It does not demand worship. It demands presence. It does not invite submission. It invites awareness. Then the question that drifts in the air like smoke is, could it be that without realizing it, I too was part of the machinery that fed that enlightened ego? It is difficult, I know, because admitting it means abandoning the fantasy that we were only victims. But recognizing one's own shadow is the first step toward no longer projecting it onto leaders of clay. There is beauty in spiritual autonomy. Sometimes it is lonely, silent, but profoundly liberating. Because when you begin to truly listen to yourself, without intermediaries, the whisper of your soul finally finds space. And in that space, you discover you no longer need teachers to place you on your knees to make you feel divine. To awaken spiritually does not mean to go out proclaiming that you are awake while pointing at those who still sleep. That is, in fact, only another illusion of the ego trying to appear awakened. True awakening demands a much harder quality to cultivate: discernment. To discern is to know that not everything that appears spiritual is in fact healthy. It is to understand that beautiful words may hide manipulative intentions, and that often what seduces us in supposedly elevated discourse is precisely what we have not yet healed within ourselves. A discerning person idolizes no one. They can learn from teachers, yes, but without surrendering their autonomy. They listen, but filter. They respect, but question. Discernment allows you to realize that genuine spirituality does not demand blind obedience, does not feed on followers, and certainly does not stand on rigid dogmas. Many who seek spiritual growth end up entering communities or following leaders who gradually gain silent power over their lives. And this happens so subtly that we barely notice it. We start only seeking answers. Then we find ourselves asking permission to think differently. When you depend on someone's approval to continue your own inner path, something is wrong. And here lies the most important point. Real spirituality brings you closer to yourself, not to an idealized figure. What truly saves us is not the grand promises of enlightenment that others may proclaim, but rather the intimate and unshakable connection with our own essence. This essence cannot be borrowed, it cannot be imitated, and it cannot be granted by anyone else. It is already within you, waiting to be recognized. You do not need to put on the appearance of being spiritual to reach it, nor must you be accepted or validated by a group to feel at peace with your soul. Authentic spirituality does not ask you to play a role. It asks you to be real. And being real requires discernment. And discernment demands a kind of courage that many people spend their entire lives avoiding. It is the courage to let go of what no longer holds meaning, even if it once gave you comfort. It is the courage to question your own behaviors and dismantle illusions that you may have clung to out of fear. It is the courage to admit that at some point you may have desired admiration for appearing more elevated or more awakened than others. This is not a flaw unique to you. It is a universal temptation. The spiritual ego is subtle, clever, and deceptive. It disguises itself as purity, wisdom, even humility. But beneath its mask lies the hunger for validation, the desire to be seen as special, to stand above the crowd rather than walk among them. Yet when you dare to listen deeply to yourself, when you strip away the masks and face your own truth with raw honesty, the spiritual ego loses its grip. Its tricks weaken, and what remains is something far more profound: the authentic search for meaning, for connection, for freedom. Awakening with discernment is not about reaching some fixed destination. It is about remembering that there is no rigid map for the soul. There are signs, encounters, teachers, but ultimately, the path is yours alone, and no one can walk it for you. The greatest trap of modern spirituality may not be found in false gurus or exploitative leaders, but in our own urgency to have someone else tell us who we are. In our rush to belong, in our longing for clarity, we often abandon the most sacred gift we have: discernment. If you are hearing these words now, it is because something inside you still longs for truth. A truth that is quiet, unpolished, and free from spectacle. A truth that does not care for stages or audiences, that does not hunger for applause, but that simply exists in the intimacy of your being. It is a truth that does not seek to win arguments or collect followers, but that lives in silence, waiting to be felt rather than displayed. The so-called spiritual narcissist is not just an external figure to be identified. It is also a shadow within ourselves. It is the voice that whispers of being too unique to belong, of wanting to save others, while secretly resisting the call to face our own wounds. This is why Carl Jung often reminded us that the greatest spiritual awakening is not about escaping into higher realms or losing ourselves in fantasies of ascension. Instead, it is about descending into our humanity, into our doubts, into the laughter that heals, into the pain that teaches, into the ordinary moments where presence is born. Enlightenment, in Jung's view, is not the radiant appearance of perfection. It is the humble act of living with integrity, with honesty, and with compassion. The highest state of consciousness is not in appearing enlightened. It is in living authentically, without disguises, without pretensions, and without fear of imperfection. In the end, the spiritual journey does not ask you to follow anyone. It asks you to walk with yourself, feet stained by the earth, heart overflowing with questions, eyes open to mysteries that cannot be captured by reason, but can only be felt in the depth of your being. The one who has truly awakened does not want disciples. They do not crave to be followed. They only wish that you awaken as well, that you too find your own essence. Carl Jung once told a story of a man who seemed almost invisible. He wore no distinctive clothing, he did not raise his voice, and he never quoted the words of famous masters. Yet, whenever he spoke, the room fell into silence. His words were not elaborate, they were simple, but within their simplicity lived an undeniable presence, a presence that made those who listened feel seen, not judged, not measured, but deeply recognized. At the end of one such gathering, someone asked him, "What is your spiritual path?" He smiled softly, with eyes that carried both kindness and clarity, and answered, "My path is to never forget that I am only one among many." That answer remained with Jung for years, because it captured a truth that no book or ritual could fully convey. No matter how much we study, no matter how much we meditate, no matter how much we try to appear evolved, if we cannot meet another human being as an equal, with empathy, with humility, with genuine presence, then all we are doing is dressing another form of ego in spiritual robes. This ego may carry incense, chant sacred words, or speak of enlightenment, but at its core, it is still hungry for recognition, still seeking to be above others, rather than beside them. If you have reached this moment, I want to thank you, not for listening to these words, but for daring to look inward, for accepting a descent that is not always comfortable, but is always necessary. Your very presence here is proof that there are souls who wish to go beyond appearances, beyond empty performances, beyond the idolatry of false masters. Souls who long for a spirituality that does not dominate, does not demand admiration, does not hide behind masks, but simply breathes through the way you live each day. And so, the invitation is this: to live a spirituality that is not staged, not forced, not adorned with glitter, but one that is alive in your silence, alive in your laughter, alive in your ability to love, to doubt, to listen, and to simply be. A spirituality that is not about ascending above life, but about entering fully into it, with all its chaos, beauty, and imperfection. That is where your essence waits. That is where truth lives. And that is where your soul, at last, can rest in freedom. If these words resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell so you don't miss the next reflection, and keep walking this path of inner truth. Remember what Carl Jung taught us. The highest form of awakening is not to appear enlightened, but to live with humility, authenticity, and a heart open to the mystery of life.